Hello and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. With me tonight, I have Mike. Hello, Mike.
I say,
And we have, it's mostly going to be Labour's continuing hatred of all things protest uh, with in the aftermath of the stabbing attack at a mosque in Manchester. We saw police, the media, and Labour arguing that somehow this should justify not protesting against the butchery of Gaza. And shortly afterwards, the new Home Secretary started talking about bans against regular protests that quite obviously are directed against the Palestine protesters. More recently, Keir Starmer has gone so far as to suggest inflammatory chants should go in the ban pot. He plans to consult members of the Jewish community, presumably not the ones who attend all the protests. We will follow this up with a bit of chat about the Tory conference because it's funny. And we shall then finish off with our usual roundup of freedom stories, including Belarus, Sudan and Congo, the death of Val Todorov, and the complete collapse, it seems, of standards in Britain's prisons. So for the first one, the Labour protest crackdown, I will hand over to Mike. Mike, what do you think about that whole mess and indeed the most recent 500 arrests odd at the protests, latest London protest?
yeah, I mean, clearly, the mass arrests continue at the protests. The protests are, and they are having an impact. I don't think we can deny they're having an impact. Anyone could deny they're having an impact, because I think the fact that the arrests are happening, they're still being reported in the way they're being reported. They're still cutting through, and there is still that outrage about the fact that people are being arrested essentially for exercising their freedom of speech, if you like. So I think that's still a massive thing, and that is reflected in a way with the opportunism of what Starmer and co have opted to do in terms of proposing these new protest bans, protest restrictions, etc. And it's got to the point now where it's just absurd. The rationales for it. I think you'd struggle to find someone who was able with a straight face to defend the rationale that this isn't about simply trying to eliminate any kind of pro-Palestinian sentiment or protest. Because all the rationales, oh, repeated protests are bad, chanting is bad. Support for a prescribed organisation obviously is a violation of the Terrorism Act, but we're going to prescribe an organisation that commits non-violent direct action, and then we're going to get into conversations about well, is non-violent direct action legitimate? And essentially, you've come back to this thing, which has been a feature, to be fair, of Labour policy, certainly since the New Labour era, that basically any protest which even mildly inconveniences anyone is beyond the pale. And really, when you drill down to it, protest is beyond the pale, really, for Labour. If it's unruly, it's awful, and it shouldn't be allowed. That's the mentality, and I think particularly with this, I think the tragedy up in Manchester, being used by the Labour Party in the way that it has been immediately, more or less, and framed that that somehow then lends some almost culpability to people campaigning over Gaza, or people protesting about what's happening in Gaza. That's the implication. They might not say that explicitly, but they're very close to saying it. The government, in terms of how they framed the response to the tragedy in Manchester. They have said, that we have, it's un-British. I think Starmer said, didn't he, about the protests, any protest that might have took place on October the 7th. And there's all sorts of elements of this that are really, really troubling. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to do fake solemnity. There are elements of this that are really troubling. One is the conflation of the Jewish community with Israel, which in my view is anti-Semitic, pure and simple. The UK Jewish community can't be conflated with Israel and can't be held responsible for what it does. And therefore, protests against Israel are not and its policies are not in themselves anti-Semitic, because they're not about Jewish people, they're about the actions of a nation state. And so I find that deeply troubling that Starmer would do that. And I think the second piece that then comes from that is, as you've said, we're going to consult with the Jewish community. Well, of course, there'll be people in the Jewish community who will very strongly support Israel, as there will be people in the Jewish community, as in all communities, who will very strongly and vociferously oppose the policies of Israel, because it's a nation state that's doing certain things that a small number of people agree with in the UK and a large number of people don't. And as you say, there are many. I've got many Jewish friends who are on these protests in support of Gaza and against the actions that the Israeli state is taking in Gaza. They don't seem to be getting listened to at all, and in fact, they seem to be getting demonized by some quarters, which is really really troubling. And also, I have friends who are Israelis in Israel who are also protesting the policies of the Israeli state, who are also being demonized and actually facing some quite severe repercussions for that. So I think the whole thing is extremely troubling. Because of the extent to which Starmer's prepared to go. Obviously, we've seen also in the last few days the CPS say they're going to appeal the dropping of the prosecution against Mokhara. When the judge basically laughed that prosecution out of the court, and yet the CPS is going to appeal it. So it is getting to the point where it is very difficult to see the invocations of potential new protest laws, the way in which politicians in the Labour Party, and I'm going to specify the Labour Party and focus on the Labour Party because they're in government, have framed the response to the tragedy in Manchester in terms of protest restrictions and the Mokhara prosecution. It's impossible not to see this, I think, now at this point, even if you were the most good faithy, most small L liberal, agnostic politically person, as anything other than an attempt at a total shutdown of any support for the Palestinian cause, and indeed, even if it's not support for the Palestinian cause per se, but just opposition to genocide in general. And that is, look, not trying to be, as I say, not trying to do fake solemnity. I sincerely believe that is really troubling because I actually genuinely still thought that the pushback on the Palestine Action prescription that we're seeing on a week-to-week basis was going to at some point hit a threshold with the government where they were going to realise that actually this isn't going to work. This is just, but now instead they've doubled down still further and they've gone down a very difficult and dangerous road, I think, in doing that. So yeah, I'm not in any way relaxed about what is happening. Obviously, this is kind of what you might expect from a government that's gone down this road before, but I think it's terrifying. Genuinely, I think it's really disturbing what's happening. I don't know what you think.
No, I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, I think with specifically with the stabbing, I think it was very much a case of this thing took off in the media, and then every tragedy is an opportunity, right? Like, obviously Netanyahu himself was coming out and in a very direct way saying, "Oh, this is a direct result of the inflammatory language being used by leftists." The tacit or specific anti-Semitism of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which has caused this. And you're like, well, is it not more the case that 2 years of mass murder might work some people up, and not even good people? I mean, from the reports, this guy doesn't seem to be a particularly great guy. But what's probably surprising is that more people haven't been worked up to this point. I mean, we know one. I mean, there's been an absolutely ludicrous idea that um, kind of tried to parallel the idea that, oh, you're victim blaming, and it's the equivalent of blaming a woman for going out in a short skirt. And it's like, well, no, it's the equivalent of someone starting a knife fight, and then, and then more violence happening. Like the same thing happened during the war on terror. It's like, yes, obviously sort of mass murder will tend to push people into more extreme positions, and it will tend to end up with violence being done by people of all different types, but usually people like this guy who seems to be more prone to it, who has an excuse, ready-made excuse to go out and do it. And um, it's then leveraged to help the mass murder continue. And it's like, well, if you're doing that, you're not actually making, I mean, you're certainly not making Jewish people any safer by starting this by continuing this rigmarole. Um, and it's by doing it, by allowing, or in fact, by encouraging uh, these kinds of actions to result in further crackdowns on protest and further crackdowns on dissent in general. Um, all of these rules are rules which are tailor-made to repress any other kind of dissent, like climate change. Um, and if you're on the right, protests against any of your bugbears. Um, and like the right wing is currently a bit upset about it because they worry, I think, largely, baselessly, frankly, that the Labour Party is going to deploy these against them. Um, but when reform gets in, there's absolutely no doubt that reform will deploy it against not just the left, but against liberals. Any protests against what reform wants to do, re migration or crackdowns on um, less radical forms of dissent, etc., etc. Well, this is all tailor-made for them.
I totally agree with that. I think, there's always this issue when you see draconian policies implemented, obviously, of how they're going to be used in the first instance, why they're being brought in. They're draconian. You don't want to see them in a society. But then also, as you say, there's also the extent where, even if there's that kind of, even if someone were to be lulled into an argument, there's a really good reason to do this. So let's take it away from the current debate completely. And let's say there was something that was, prima facie unarguable. There's a group that is pursuing some sort of action that really imperils safety of large numbers of people, and we need to. And obviously, anytime you have that and you think, okay, there is a legitimate reason to do something about something. And then you say, okay, but our answer is draconian policy. Well, the problem then is always, as you say, well, once you've done that once, you can do that for anything. And clearly, then when the next administration comes in, next government comes in, they can use it for what they like. In this case, I think most people, certainly in the UK actually now, would agree that there's no way this merits, the kind of repressive measures that are being used against it. And so, when reform come in, as you say, it's quite right to anticipate that this would be very dangerous in their hands. But like, it's one of the things I keep thinking about when it comes to Labour. In some ways, we probably got what it's 2025 now. We've probably got 3 years still to reform government minimum. Um, it's bad enough under Labour. Do you know what I mean? It's a situation where I think, because Labour are so desperate for whatever poorly calculated tactical or philosophical reason, or even ideological reason, if they really believe this, to appear as right wing as humanly possible, then over the next 3 years, I could easily see Labour using the same powers to repress any, as you say, climate change or any other group it might be, any small L liberal group it might be. I mean, there are lots of groups in society, lots of minority groups who are being increasingly marginalised by the political process. You know, members of the queer community like myself, we don't have much of a voice in Parliament at the moment. If we go out and protest a particular law, for instance, or a particular instrument of government or whatever it is, are we going to be criminalised because we use, because, and also the way in which again, coming back to the framing around the response to the attack, the way in which this has been narrativized, in a broad sense, not just in relation to the attack, is there's a rhetorical use of a community to justify a particular measure. So a community feels unsafe, therefore we must do this. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that members of the Jewish community feel unsafe partly because they've told me. So, I absolutely believe that is the case. So that's not to question that. What I am questioning is that whether or not some people going on a march is actually making people unsafe. That is the question. And the issue then becomes, well, obviously someone like the person that you've talked about, the attacker themselves, they do make the Jewish community very unsafe. People like that do. And this link that Netanyahu and others, including in Parliament, have tried to make between the Palestine solidarity movements and people like this, then is obviously meant to be the X factor in driving this stuff forward. But look, there's no evidence that there is a link between the Palestine solidarity movement and people like this. In fact, if you rewind 20 odd years, let's go to a different context. We go back to the period of 7/7, when 7/7 happened. And this is to your point, really, about what is called in counter-extremism circles radicalization, what policy people call it radicalization. If you go back to 7/7, when 7/7 happened, one of the first things that the government of the day, which was again a Labour government, did very aggressively in the wake of that was to say there was no link between this and the government's policy on Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, of course, some testimonies came out from the bombers that it was absolutely to do with the government's foreign policy, which is why they had chosen to do this. The point being that there wasn't, I mean, yes, there had been a big Iraq march in 2003, which delivered absolutely no effect in terms of stopping the government, but there wasn't a link drawn then between, oh, well, this is because some lefties have gone out and said some stuff. That wasn't the rationale then, even though the then government was very draconian. They tried to bring in 90 days detention a few months earlier. Um, and so when you fast forward to now, there's a continuity in Labour policy over those 20 odd years that every single response they come up with is an incredibly draconian response. But now they're using a different rhetorical framework to justify it. This is 20 years ago, the Labour Party would have put you in jail for 3 months on suspicion of an offence you may not have committed. Now it's banning people from saying stuff. It's banning people from. It's encouraging, if not explicitly ordering, law enforcement to arrest people on suspicion of things based on what T-shirt they're wearing. That's where we're at now. So yeah, and coming back to the point again that you raised about what's going on in terms of Israel's conduct in Gaza, that is happening independently of anything the Palestine Solidarity Movement is doing. That will, to use that phrase from policy people, radicalize people independently of anything they're doing. And to be clear, let's be absolutely clear about this. That Jewish community that was tragically attacked in Manchester bears no responsibility whatsoever for what is happening in Gaza, none. But that's not going to stop certain people who have, whatever it is, some sort of ideological belief system or some sort of, some sort of problem with a particular minority group doing something utterly evil. I'll use that word. It's not a very anarchist word. Um, but we can't fall into that trap. We can't fall into the trap on the other side of saying, well, we equate the Jewish community in Manchester with Israel. The Jewish community in Manchester is not responsible for what Israel is doing at all. But equally, that means that a policy response to what happened in Manchester shouldn't be about Israel. It absolutely should not be about Israel. It should be about what can we do to help the Jewish community be safe. It should not be about what Israel is doing in Gaza, because that's the mistake the attacker made. We don't want to make that mistake as well.
And it should be outright repudiating and telling off the likes of Netanyahu and the Israeli state for attempting to make those links. Um, because this is something which Netanyahu's basically going out of his way to say, well, members of my community, i.e., the Jews who are all part of Israel de facto, um, have been attacked. There should be an immediate pushback saying, no, these people in Manchester who are Jewish are not Israelis. They are not, they are not responsible for, nor should they be held to be the same as the policy of of the Knesset. But none of that happened. It's a thing that Netanyahu, when he says stuff like that, not only is he not, called out for making essentially an anti-Semitic statement, as you rightly pointed out earlier, but there's no intimation that that Jewish people in Manchester aren't. They're just British Jews in Manchester. Um,
No, there's a huge amount of apprehension. I think particularly from I mean, obviously it would probably be the case, certainly now where the right's gone from most of the major political parties in government. But, you know, yeah, there's particular apprehension at the minimum of the Labour Party of being prepared to call Netanyahu out for anything, as we've seen over a long period of time. Independently of what happened in Manchester. Clearly the response to issues in Gaza itself. There are the fact that we don't even know, or we still haven't publicly seen, the legal advice that has agitated so many civil servants that the government has received about what's happening in Gaza and what that might mean for the government's complicity. But no, I mean, I think this is another line, as you say, because this is the leader of a foreign nation state talking about British citizens and using British citizens to talk about something that is another nation state's policy, which they're not responsible for. So yeah, no, I do find that particularly galling, but it's par for the course now with this government, and it's horrific, but also it's I'd say it's predictable, except for the fact that I still felt that actually the response to the attack would be more measured and more respectful of what actually happened, rather than being this, okay, we've got all this stuff that we want to do, so we're going to use this as an opportunity to do that. Because it very much felt pre-packed in terms of that we're going to ban the chanting, we're going to ban repeated protests. These are things that Labour has thought about doing for a while. These are escalatory anti-protest measures Labour's had on the book for a while. I mean, with the prescription of Palestine Action, we learned that that's something that Yvette Cooper had been considering for quite some time, and I believe used the issue around the RAF bases at the moment to do it. But it's something they've been on the transom for a while. So I think that's another thing that's particularly, I'm going to say despicable. Something that's particularly despicable is the idea these are preheated policy ideas. These are things that have already been ready to go, and they've been deployed at a time when it's felt that there can be there can be a generation of a feeling in the media that will enable that to be supported. So yeah, now yeah, I mean, deeply troubling is almost, I've said it 3 times, but it's almost not enough because yeah, I think it's horrific. I think the inability of the British state to articulate a position. And the thing I would urge people who are based in Britain, because obviously I imagine most of our viewers, listeners are based in Britain, albeit, obviously we are talking about international stuff as well. I think the thing to bear in mind if you're British, and it's something I have to, is it's not like this everywhere. Notwithstanding the fact that, obviously the world hasn't done enough on a lot of issues around Israeli policy in recent times. Netanyahu says something, for example, about Spanish citizens or Irish citizens, there'll be a response from the government. It is, and I'm not trying to say that, oh, okay, now all anarchists like some governments and not others. I'm just saying that actually the way the regimes work in different places is different. And the UK has gone down a particular path with this, which is, again, as I say, deeply disturbing.
I think in terms of Britain's attitude towards protest, we're rapidly catching up with considerably more autocratic regimes in terms of how badly restricted we are. Like there's a kind of a headline difference in terms of, oh well, when people get arrested, they're just kind of gently carried away, but that's down to the protesters. It's not down to the police. Um, it's very difficult to like the police are smart enough not to be caught battening someone in a wheelchair before they pull them away, or cracking 80-year-old skulls. Um, but it's mostly, the people who are still feeling able to go out now are increasingly people who are sort of just reliant on the fact that they're not natural targets to be smacked about. Um,
I read a
you
piece
know,
on this the other day, mate, and I think it was really interesting when you talk about the demographics of who is protesting as well. There's been a lot of rhetoric, if we're honest, in the media about, oh, look, they're vicars, they're GPs, they're retired this, they're retired RAF personnel in some cases, etc. Military people and so on. But one of the things in the piece that I read about the background of them is, yeah, there's a media impact that comes from, let's be honest, the fact that these aren't the usual suspects, by which they mean what the people the right wing press typically demonize, which are minorities, young people, and so they have that privilege, if you like, which enables them to have an impact in the media. But the other piece that came out in the piece I was reading, now I apologize, I forget where I read it, but it's more prosaic. It's also these folks that are out protesting, getting arrested, their houses are paid off. They've got pensions. That if they get nicked, and they get nicked on a terrorism charge, and they can't work, it's not actually a problem for them in the way that it would be for most people. Um, so, but I think that is the point. It proves what you're saying, in that actually, if you're in lots of other places globally, certainly in Europe, if you're in lots of other places, you could protest without fear of the level of repercussion that you have to consider in the UK. And I think the thing to bear in mind, as you say, is that, yeah, people might be getting carried away limply because of who the protesters are. But at the same time, it's also a feature of the fact that actually they can be carried away limply, because ultimately what's really going to happen is the hammer's going to come down if they're charged. If they're charged, what they actually face is the real deterrent rather than getting your skull caved in. Because, we have seen in the past plenty of protests. If you go back to the pre-social media age, I think social media has had a big impact on this. If you go back to the pre-social media age, if you go back to the 80s, Orgreave, etc., all that sort of stuff, police were very happy to cave heads in. There's a famous photo at Orgreave of the mounted police officer, the female photographer is about to get her head stoved in. But that was the exception that proved the rule because there was a photo of that. So there were quite so it's almost flipped. It's almost like in the 80s and 90s, Battle of the Beanfield, all this sort of stuff. Police were very happy to cave people's heads in on a regular basis. But then you'd, you know, go to hospital or do a night in the cells bleeding and then you'd be released. Whereas now it's a case of we'll carry you away limply and by the way, you're not working again and you could be looking at 5 to 10 years or something like that. So, yeah, that's the kind of way in which I think the balance of it is flipped. But as you say, it puts the UK in line with some very, very draconian places. And I do think there's that. I mean, it's interesting looking at the media. If you look at print news, which still generates a significant part of the news cycle, and I go into what was WH Smith's, which is now TG Jones, not to advertise people's brands, but when I go in and look, when the Guardian is, we've talked about this before, but the Guardian is what it is. But that's about the only paper I see which has a different view to the absolutely rampant these whatever do-gooders deserve what's coming to them that comes from everything else. So I think it's a very challenging space to actually get a narrative out there that yeah, actually your country is getting this bad, it really is. Because I don't think that's something that finds an echo in much of the print media, to be honest.
Well, certainly not from the left. I mean, if anything happens to the right, then they will go completely ballistic. But Labour's been very careful about things not being done to the right, because it is fundamentally quite craven when it comes to falling afoul of the news cycle. I mean, there's a good argument that the draconian nature of its legislation, both recent and upcoming, is a direct result of, as you say, a relatively unified. I mean, even the Guardian doesn't spend much time. Um, you'll get articles from kind of a handful of worthies, kind of ringing the alarm bell, but for the most part, the Guardian is not not terribly, and it is the only large paper left that would count itself as left, really, um, much as we probably wouldn't. But it doesn't make a big deal about this sort of stuff, and it doesn't really want to be that far outside the media consensus. I mean, one of the absolutely weird things, I think, in how we, as observers, experience modern protest is that on the one hand, we look at the incredibly polite forms of protest which are predominant in Britain now. Like, we're not rioting, we're not like getting into fights with cops or indeed even with fascists for the most part, right? Like the fascists themselves, we see a handful of kind of them acting poorly. They, get into a few scuffles here and there. But beyond the far right riots from last year, um, we see very little violence on the streets of Britain. But the legislation uh, is put in force as though it were. But simultaneously, we're watching in the US, a country with, you know, armed police and a paramilitary force with near unlimited money, being rolled into communities fighting back violently at times and understandably so, frankly. Um, and whilst the rhetoric coming from the right wing press is similar to what we see in our own press, there is also a large groundswell of other press and the major comedians on the circuit, like Neil Oliver and oh come on, Daily Show guy. Um,
John Oliver? Do we mean John Oliver?
John Oliver, sorry, Neil Oliver's
I was going to
the
say, I was just
Scottish
carefully
conspiracy
stepping in.
theorist.
Yeah. John Oliver. Daily Show guy,
um,
John Stewart. Is that right?
John
Mm.
Stewart, yeah.
Stephen Colbert. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are all, you know, pointing out that yeah, these things are localized and they are um, in response to excessive and ongoing brutality. And the the tone of the conversation that goes on in the US is often unhinged, but there's actually a conflictual conversation going on. Whereas I don't think that's really the case in Britain. There isn't, there's Novara Media and Byline Times and like a handful of outlets um, which will actually sort of say, yeah, no, this media status quo, this understanding, this unified understanding that it has, makes no sense and doesn't stand up under any scrutiny. But for the most part, there's a unified media, political, um, corporate, and policing sphere that is all turning what are peaceful, non-violent protests and sometimes direct action protests that don't harm anybody into this kind of uh, totemic struggle against violent anti-Semites. It's absolutely bizarre to watch.
If you can indulge me a tiny sports segue, but it is relevant to this point. I'm a big rugby person, so and don't judge me, everyone who's a class warrior, because I come from rugby league territory, which was the original rebel code in 1895, working class sport and all that. Reason I bring that up is St Helens Rugby Club got knocked out of the playoffs the other day. And there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with the coach, Paul Wellens. A lot of unhappiness amongst fans. Anyway, after the game, someone did something stupid on social media and sent a message to the St Helens Club account threatening some stuff. The St Helens media team, and this was reported quite widely, I think the BBC quite sensibly actually chose not to report this, but other outlets, Sky Sports, various other outlets did report it. The St Helens media team put out a statement saying that terrorist threat had been made against the St Helens team bus after the game. This is last weekend. And this was, as I say, widely reported. And then a slightly more measured statement came out from the police, as you might expect, saying that, yes, they had understood a malicious communication had been received and they were investigating something under the Malicious Communications Act and that it was a threat. They didn't use the word terrorism. The reason I bring this up is we've gone through a period in Britain, I think, and this is specific to Britain in quite the way it's panned out, and this is to your point, where basically we've gone to a point where criticism of someone, even a threat against an individual, the word terrorism, people feel free to drop it. And I do think the government's played a massive role in that. Now, it's clear, like the St. Helens media team went a bit wild with that. It was a threat. It was a horrible thing to do. It was obviously somebody who should not have done that. And obviously we feel for the players and for the staff of the club and their families. But it's not terrorism, And we have got to a point where like you get MPs, for instance, get a bit of criticism on social media and being persecuted. And I do think that's what has happened over an extended period of time, Britain. We've got to a point now where, and I know social media has fried people's brains across the Atlantic and elsewhere, but we've got to a point in the UK where any sort of criticism can, depending on who's talking about it, be denoted as, well, do you know what? That's terrorism. That's really bad. That's something. I think with going to your point then about the media consensus and the difference in the US is I think for one, I think the US has a history across the partisan divide of much more vocal media outspokenness, if you like, or much more vocal media interjection. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle it comes from. Clearly, the Republicans have a stranglehold on politics now in the US, and the Democrats aren't doing anything all that. But a lot of the outlets are still saying stuff and will continue to. I think the other thing as well is there's also a much more critical tradition, not just in the mainstream, if you like, news media, but also in kind of specialist magazines. I mean, if you take, for example, some of, if you like, the rebel magazines in the US that are covering the Trump presidency really, critically, Wired, technology magazines, they're being very critical at times and, raising lots of things and getting big audiences. So there's a much more diversified press anyway, still, than there is here. Obviously, we've seen the demise of the local press in the UK, which is a slightly separate piece. We've seen, I mean, going back to the Flat Earth News stuff, from years ago, Nick Davis, I think it was, the way in which the media has changed in Britain, where you don't have specialist correspondence anymore, where basically people regurgitate crap. I was originally a journalist, as I think, I know we both have worked in the media. So there's a massive transition even from when I was a young journalist, nearly 30 years ago to now. So I think there's a combination of different things. I think the media landscape in Britain has become awful in terms of the ownership, in terms of the way in which journalists are trained and recruited and developed. Um, and also at the same time, there's been alongside that this policing of speech on an informal level to the point where any sort of criticism can be seen as something awful if it criticizes the establishment or power, which has led to a perfect storm of awfulness. I mean, to take one final anecdote before I shut up for a change, also at the start of the pandemic, I remember there was a news report, I forget who it was now, but there was one journalist who condemned armchair epidemiologists who dared question the government's policy. And it became very clear at that point that the media saw its role as gatekeeping and protecting the government, which was bizarre. I don't feel that that's uniform across the American media in the same way that it is here. But I think that's also classed here. I think one of the impacts of social media, for better or worse, well, actually for better in this case, definitely in this case, has been it has empowered people to criticize people who, because of their class position historically, you couldn't criticize. You wouldn't have access to do it if you were a lad with a Scouse accent. You weren't going to be on Radio 4. So you couldn't criticize the government from the point of view of the PM program because you'd never be on it. But you could on Twitter go viral because you pointed out something that was obviously idiotic by a government minister. And I think class plays a big part in that. People shouldn't speak up to their betters. And I think that's part of the issue and way in which this media homogeneity has come in, because I do think there's a class solidarity there that is also slightly absent in the US. So that's a long exegesis from me, but there we go.
No, no, it's a good bit. Yeah, I mean, I would also say so one of the things that I think, obviously, we've spent the last 3, 4 years in particular having this kind of anti-wokeism and anti-cancel culture thing batted at us, right? Um, but there's been a consistent kind of push that the idea that the left can't deal with criticism and therefore tries to shut people down, tries to lose people their jobs. And there's 100% there was a small section of the left that had that as a tendency. Um, I think it was always wildly overblown in terms of the amount of power it had. There was a handful of people who were vulnerable to it, but Jimmy Carr's never lost any work because because he was cancelled. Um, we've got so I mean, in the most recent case, obviously, we've got a bunch of very famous comedians going to the Riyadh festival, the sort of people who had spent their entire careers whining about free speech, going to signing a thing saying you can joke about anything except you can't slag off Saudi Arabia, you can't slag off the concept of royalty, etc., etc. Um, but now that the far right is approaching and in some cases holds power, we're seeing these exact strategies used, and they're being used because they've already kind of pre-laid the idea that, if we're doing it, we're just doing what's already acceptable because the left's been doing it. So you end up with this really aggressive policing of tone, of language. And in Labour's case, obviously, we're getting to the point where they're starting to make demands on what can even be said at protests. This is, the most recent one that's come out is, I think one of the lines is make the Intifada global, which I'm not a huge fan of as a line. I think that it's so open to interpretation that it kind of opens the door for people to make accusations uh, about it, regardless of what you actually mean by it. But the idea that it should be banned is a significant extension of what free speech is supposed to be, or reduction rather, of what free speech is supposed to be in this country. Um, and I think that, yeah, like a lot of it bases itself on this kind of consensus that's been built over a while over um, the idea that the left should be stopped from restricting free speech. The right should be allowed to say roughly what it wants, and the government should be allowed to ban pretty much whenever it's convenient. Um, and you do sort of end up looking at this and going, okay, so where are the gaps for specifically the what's occasionally called the cobweb left, the ATB marching types? Where are the gaps left where these people can organise their big marches and their big sit-down protests and be allowed to do them even? Um,
No, I agree, and I think going back to the point about anti-wokeism and the cancel culture debate and all that, I always thought that was spurious. Obviously, I was in universities for a long time, and so I was on sort of on the front line of that for a period of time, and professionally wrote a little bit about it as well. But like for me, and I use this word advisedly. I know it has connotations, but I use this word advisedly. I think the whole cancel culture framing was a right wing attempt to gaslight the public. And it's got a long history. That was semi-imported from the US. There've been a long tradition in the US of trying to imply that the radical left, which was never really that radical, was trying to shut down freedom of speech or destroy our traditions or our heritage and so on. And all this stuff has gone. And to be honest, actually, that goes back as far as the immediate post-war period and the Red Scare and McCarthyism and all that. It goes back to that because, of course, what was really happening then was essentially a right wing attempt to shut down any left wing speech, which is what the House of Un-American Affairs Committee, House of Un-American Affairs Committee was, and all that. And so in the UK, I think what's happened certainly in the last 20 years, certainly with regard to universities and things like the Office for Students introducing free speech duty on universities and pursuing that the way that they have. It's very much been what you said. Like it's a license for right wingers to say what they want, and also have a kind of submissive audience. They want the students to sit there and just accept it, and because the argument is universities have become left wing hotbeds. Michael Gove used to call educationists the blob. And it's very
yeah,
much adopted from a US template. Whereas the reality of it is really quite prosaic. If you look at it in terms of social economic terms, why did universities suddenly become left wing places? Because they did. There's no denying that they did. It wasn't because everyone started reading Marx or even critical race theory or anything like that. It was because from the 60s onwards, the writers targeted public sector professionals fairly consistently, and universities produce people who become professionals and end up in the public sector, and also the teaching bodies are primarily you primarily have a public sector consciousness, even if they're not actually in the public sector. And so, you target these people socioeconomically for decades, then guess what? They don't vote for you anymore. And then the reality, it's not because they're reading critical race theory or anything like that. Some of them will be, and fair play. I hope more people do, and they should. But the reality is that's not the reason they're not voting for you. So what do? You come up with a straw man argument, which is actually they're not. These people aren't voting for us because they've been brainwashed by these mates. If they've been brainwashed by those arguments, it must mean they're good arguments because they're convincing bright people, right? So maybe you should read the books and see what you make of. But the reality is, no, we'll make a straw man argument, or demonize. And in a society where, in universities' case, you've still got half the population at any of the younger age cohorts that doesn't go to university, and at older age cohorts, you've got more than that don't go to university. And in the older age cohorts, you're going to have people who've got relatives who've gone to university in a marketized society and then run up massive debts and gone into the world unable to find work, and then maybe actually are aggrieved at university because they feel they've been ripped off, which is not the fault of the academics, it's the fault of government and the professional services staff that work there. It's not their fault either, it's the fault of government. And you've got a perfect storm. That's one sector. But I think it applies across the board because actually, if you look at the kinds of people who, as you say, the minority on the left who we're actually actively trying to cancel, it's not always the case, of course. And there's always going to be actors that are going to do stuff they really shouldn't do. But I won't go into too many specifics, but folks who know the stories will be able to identify potentially some of the protagonists. You look at some places where some people did try to get, where the left did try to cancel some people. They might be advocates of race science, for instance. So you might be in a situation where people have explicitly published work that says they believe, for example, that certain ethnic groups have lower IQs and shouldn't be in universities. Well, if you're somebody from that ethnic group who's in a university, you might have a particular view on that, and I'd understand that. And I'd support that, to be honest, because I don't think you should be taught by people who think you're inferior. So I think that's the first one. The second one, plenty of people, there were issues about cancelling people who objected to pride flags being flown. So basically, because what somebody wanted was to limit somebody else's freedom of speech, their ability to play a pride flag or something. Some people protested and said that person was trying to shut down freedom of speech. So the whole thing is so convoluted and the problem is it drags us into arguments that are bad faith, right? And it did for years. It dragged us into arguments saying, well, actually, no, we're not really about this. We're really in favour of freedom of speech and all this. And it was never really about that. That's why I use the word gaslighting. What it was really about, really, was the right wanted to be able to say what they've always wanted to be able to say. The right wanted to pursue policies they've always wanted to pursue: racial inequality, inequality of gender, persecution of diverse genders and people who are gender non-conforming, persecution of women. The right wants to pursue these things in terms of sections of the right, of course, not all of the right, but sections of the right want to pursue this, and substantial sections of the right want to pursue this. And I think the issue is it never really went away. It's always been there. It's certainly always been there on the American right. It's just a question of it got to a point where socially there was a consensus that was more or less progressive on certain values issues. They didn't like that. They created a straw man. They used money and power to be able to push that straw man to the point where it's rhetorically vindicated or legitimated what they're doing as they see it. And then we end up in a situation where in the US, apparently Portland is war ravaged when there's a load of people dressed as dinosaurs and Godzilla dancing around a boombox celebrating or protesting. That's not war ravaged. But apparently, if you tell enough people it is, they'll believe it. So, yeah, no, I'm with you 100. I think it's a terrifying time simply because of the fact that this is about rationalization of positions, right? People need enough evidence to believe what they want to believe. And that's a scary thing because then, ultimately, it may sound like an old liberal here, but ultimately, how do you convince those people of something different? Folks can write great articles, freedom and do from all over the world. And obviously we reach our audience. But even if that was put in front of someone, if somebody's just not going to believe it, what do we do? What's the agenda then?
I mean, yeah, it's absolutely a huge problem that I mean, I've been seeing an awful lot of people just flat out disbelieving facts and statistics because it doesn't fit with their feelings. As ever, facts don't care about your feelings is an extremely ironic comment, given how the right depends so heavily on the latter. Uh, How a comment from No Don't, I anecdotally see maybe more organic backlash about the digital ID plan by Labour. Um, yeah, we were kind of talking about this last week, um, and I would tend to agree. I think that there is an opportunistic attack on ID cards on ID, digital ID from the likes of Farage because it fits into a certain demographic that they are courting, particularly the more conspiratorial right demographic, I think. Um, but there is also, there is a broader dislike of it. I think there's probably an argument to be made that there is an element of British culture, and I always say these things advisedly because the idea that there is one British culture is not, terribly accurate most of the time. Um, but a general dislike of government snooping into private lives has always been, certainly when I was growing up, was always a part of quite broad swathes of British culture. And I think that has repeatedly manifested in a dislike of things like identity cards. I mean, during Blair's term, it was most noticeable because people were, even then, saying, identity cards had been a part of life in various European countries for years. But Britain is a bit different. It was actually a form of the British exceptionalist creed to say that we don't do that sort of thing here. I think it's broken down considerably because of, just the introduction of widespread databasing on things like the NHS, which there was resistance and dissent against the broad databasing of people's NHS records, but it didn't really get into the direct action model. It was much more of a kind of way, just don't sign away your rights kind of thing. Um, and obviously, it's been diluted quite a lot by corporate databasing and the ways in which we've just become used to it. But I think there is very definitely a much broader and yes, organic position against ID cards and digital ID on that basis alone. Um,
No, I agree entirely, and I think, as you say, Farage wants to court that conspiratorial vote that is out there, that is real, that is growing. Actually, if you, as I keep saying whenever I'm on, if you follow Facebook community groups across the country, it's real, it's out there, and it's growing. But I think going back to your point about the 90s, yeah, I mean, I was involved, quite heavily involved in the anti-ID stuff at the time, you know, and the argument against it, or the argument against it, was very much couched in a kind of British exceptionalist language, and that was why how the Lib Dems managed to make a bit of an alliance with the Conservatives, over it, because the Lib Dems are opposing it ostensibly on civil liberties grounds. Some of the Conservatives are opposing it on un-British grounds, and some Conservatives who are kind of what you'd call wet Tories back in the day, they were opposing it on civil liberties grounds as well. But I remember the phrase that actually got a lot of currency, because the other thing that it did was, as ever, and things are going to be successful in Britain, it had an anti-left tinge to it as well as an anti-right. Was, we're not a papers please society. We're not a papers please society. That's not who we are. We're liberal individualists. So we don't do that sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there is an organic resistance to it, and I think going to your point about the NHS database and into this, I think it's I think it's going to be less potentially some of the ID opposition this time than last time, as you say, because of what you said. We've been acculturated to it. A couple of beeps just gone there. It's my mobile phone going off. That's the world we live in. How many people actually use a browser like Brave or go on every website, and as I do because I'm a massive nerd, and it reject on all the cookies things. I don't imagine too many people. And I think the other piece that comes off that is, it's becoming more or less impossible to do sometimes, to opt out. Because even on some of those websites, if you send media sites, you can't do that anymore. You've got to reject and pay, right? So I think people are more acculturated to giving up their data, and even unconsciously giving up their data. So I think it's going to be a harder battle to win. But nonetheless, I do agree about the comments on yourself that I think there is organic opposition to it in a way that you're not going to see more as simply for like anti-protest laws in general, because a lot of people just hate protest. They do. There's this horrible kind of, particularly English, I will say this, particularly English, very English mentality of like, get out of the road. I want to go somewhere. This is inconvenience to me. No. But on the other hand, they'll see digital ID as an inconvenience and intrusion to them, so it can still capture some of those people. So yeah, I do think there'll be more organic opposition to that. And maybe some of the success of trying to oppose some of the protest legislation will be trying to connect the dots on those things. Maybe, I don't know.
it's actually just as a little aside bit, I suppose it's quite noticeable that the form of protest that has dominated the right wing recently has been uh, rather than blocking paths. I mean, as you say, it's the whole "get out of my way, I'm trying to go somewhere" thing, right? Um, and the strongest uh, complaint being, well, what if you get in the way of the emergency services or someone needing to go to the hospital, or etc., etc. Is that they've all been very, if we're in the road, it's for about 30 seconds to do a St. George's cross, or we're just by the side of the road putting a flag on a lamppost kind of thing. It strikes me that maybe the right has kind of talked itself into a kind of, oh, we shouldn't ever actively block the road, so we should work our way around it kind of model. Um,
I think the other
Interesting.
thing, I know we're probably going to go on to other things, but just before we get off that, like one thing I want to say about that, I think what the right's done very well, actually, and the extent to which this has been kind of stewarded by the right, far right, and the sense to which is organic, is it does spectacle well, increasingly. It does spectacle well, and those people who are obviously interested in the history of fascism from an anti-fascist perspective, which obviously I know we all are, will know that in theory, in the theory and practice, like, or theory and history of fascism, spectacle is a big element. It is a big element of dominating the imagination, performance of ritual in public space, right? It's one of the reasons why remembrance rituals and the public performance of the military are so important to the far right because they make real or make visible an idea of nation that they want to put across. But to that point, like, hanging George's crosses everywhere and painting them on a roundabout, it's spectacle. It's spectacle. It's a way of making something that is imagined, maybe only by a handful of people, look much bigger than it is. And it's very powerful because also, like, yeah, you can read lots of different meanings off the flag, and this is one of the reasons why I don't think, people like Gary Neville who say the flag. I mean, to be fair, he did pull it down. Fair play to him on that, albeit he then did both sides, the right and the left. Um, but people like that who say, well, the flag itself is not a problem, are not going to get anywhere because their vision of the flag, is not one that is shared by these people, but also is increasingly not one shared by a larger and larger group of the public who these people are reaching. But yeah, they're good at spectacle. They are good at spectacle. And it's something like, for example, I don't think we on the left have been as good at recently. I think historically we've been better at it. I think we've been better at it in the past. I think even as far, even as recently as the 90s and the 80s, actually, some of the campaigns we did, there was
Mm.
much more in terms of the spectacle and the spectacular. I think, as you say, we've become too polite, but we've become polite in ways that aren't as visible. If we can capture the visual imagination a bit more, we might actually get a bit more coverage, because that is actually one of the problems.
Actually, the retreat. So the couple of things. I think there was a so we used to be able to do mass stuff up into the early 2000s. Probably stops around 9/11 really, um, or just after. But you used to have things like critical mass, and reclaim the streets, and these big set twos which people did, and then you have the climate camps coming out of that as well. Um, and increasingly, we ended up doing a lot of symbolic direct actions which relied almost entirely on spectacle, right? So you had things like the big banner drops that Greenpeace still does, actually, and things which are not really going to stop a thing from happening, but it might slow it down and certainly gives a good photo opportunity, right? So, like the big pickets in front of the fracking um, operations, all this kind of stuff. Um, and all of those things were us doing varying forms of spectacle. But the problem was that they became less spectacle because they became more kind of everyday. People had already seen that kind of photo, already seen that kind of action. Um, and B, because the media has very deliberately sidelined these things as a methodology of if you don't show what's happening, then the spectacle has no visual hook for people to remember. Um, but this feeds into, so I've actually been, I say rereading, I only got, to my shame, I only got about halfway through it the first time, but Post-Internet Far Right, relatively short book actually by friends of ours from writing for Dog Section Press. Um, and an awful lot of what they write about is you can see the continuation and reflection of what they were talking about in terms of the building of online manipulation of public perception, things which are deliberately ludicrous and outlandish and the sort of stuff that'll get picked up on by the media. But also, like I was reading, they did the example of I don't know whether you remember stickers that went up around various places in America which said it's okay to be white. Um, and it was very, very simple. White sticker, sans serif. That was just it. That was the whole of it. And the point that the book makes is that what that does is it provokes an immune response from the left, right? So the left responds to this by, well, obviously this is fascists pushing a white supremacist agenda, right? And you react when these pictures of these stickers crop up on a lamppost or whatever. Your response is, oh, the fascists are at it again. Normal people are like, well, I'm white and I don't really understand what this is about, and why are you shouting at me that I'm fascist? And it's a methodology of persuading people that left-wing anti-fascist responses are unreasonable. And the flags strike me as almost identical in approach. right? Like it's this thing where, well, how can you possibly be upset that I've put this flag on a post somewhere, or I've painted a George cross? What do you hate Britain? Um, and for weirdo radicals like us, the answer is probably, well, I don't care about Britain as a concept. I'm not a great fan of what it does as a political monstrosity. But it for most people, those conversations and those arguments are way down the line from where they would be usually, right? So it prompts um, a conceptualization of opposition to the far right being a bit weird and loopy, right? And they're very good at it, as you say. They've been practicing it for a long time now. They've been pushing increasingly these kinds of ideas, and they've gotten very professional at it. Now, of course, they have large sums of money to do it. I mean, it's no coincidence that the U.S. or at least I wouldn't say it without sounding too conspiratorial. Um, I don't think it's any coincidence that U.S. money has entered the UK far right political scene at the same time as all of a sudden everyone was buying St George's crosses by the truckload, driving them out on a weekday and hanging them up and all the rest of it.
I don't think that's conspiratorial at all. I think there's plenty of documentary evidence that there's been a huge amount of US money that has gone into the far right in the UK in recent times, and I'm sure some of that's getting spent on, inflating the logistical capabilities of the flag manufacturing industry. So I'm sure that's the case. Hopefully they can knock out pride flags just as easily, but or red and black ones. But no, I think the other thing that I wanted to say was just on the thing about space. There's also location where you do it, and I think one of the things with ourselves, as you say, we got into this big set piece thing of banner drops and big locations and things like that. And in a way, I certainly don't want to claim led by donkeys by any means. But led by donkeys, the things that they do with projecting onto the Houses of Parliament or whatever they're projecting onto, those sorts of things. They have a cachet up to a point. But I think one of the impacts of, as you say, both those stickers and the flags now is they're happening in communities. And so what they're doing very effectively in a way they can't do with physical manpower is they're saying this is our space. This is our space. And they can't do that with physical manpower most of the time. We've had a couple of bad reverses. There was a bad reverse in Manchester recently, and there was obviously what happened in London not so long ago. There's been a couple of situations where actually we can't be as glib as we used to be about we hold the city sort of thing, because they have been out in numbers. And also, like anyone like me who does spend a lot of time talking to people who don't have political opinions that are the same as mine, and because of the kind of communities that I've lived in, it is growing in massively, that sentiment. But they still don't have the numbers to take over the whole of the north end of Liverpool, for instance. But they do have the ability to give the impression their presence is much more significant than it is, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because people then get involved in it. And going back to the stickering thing, one thing I mean, I may have mentioned it on the review before. One thing that I really noticed where they were becoming very effective was how often they were stickering outside job centres. After 2008, certainly after the coalition, late 2000 teens, if you like, lots of stickers outside job centres about immigrants. And that was having an impact, on claimants who were actually being persecuted by the state, but nonetheless, then were being given an easy target to go and pick on. So they choose their space well as well, and that's a horrible thing to say, because the flip side of saying this is our space for them is also saying it's not yours, and clearly that's very much targeted at people from global majority populations, and people who are ethnically diverse in the UK. It's I think minorities. It's definitely targeted at them, so it's making them unwelcome. And we've seen, obviously, there's also been stuff that we've seen in terms of people painting St George's crosses on the houses of people they believe to be immigrants and so on. So there's a very targeted thing going on there as well. But yeah, they are very mindful of the spaces that they're doing it in. Whereas, at the end of the day, if you do a big banner drop on the Houses of Parliament, problem is now, banner drops on places like the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Bridge, or whatever, they've been done that many times. there's not really any novelty to them. The press reports novelty. And going to that final point just there on the media coverage, I actually think it was interesting about the St. George's crosses was I knew they were happening before it was in the media.
Mm.
A lot of people that I know knew it was happening before it was in the media because it was happening. I think it started, it may have started in Birmingham, but it started there, but it spread through Facebook pretty much across the country. And the media didn't start reporting it as a national story for a few weeks after it started in Birmingham. So it took a while for the media to cotton onto it, which kind of shows, that actually, if you look at the left stuff, one-off banner drop, like I'm not saying we should take lessons from the far right about what they do, but the reality is in terms of the media ecosystem, once it was everywhere and people were talking about it, the media had to get on board and talk about it because they didn't. They were basically going to be behind the story. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to try and intimidate anybody, but what I am saying is that where they're doing it, the spaces that they're in, is having an impact on the media ecosystem as well, because it feels like it's everywhere, even if it's not.
Yeah. It's also, I think, as a little aside, it's worth noting that one thing the media isn't saying, for example, is that the far right is not having it all its own way either. So I keep an eye on the Norwich anti-fascist Instagrams. Hello to any folks in there who might be watching. Um, and they've been doing some cracking work in terms of confronting, like, it's very small crews of people. There's maybe a dozen of them in Norwich who are wandering around with all these flags doing all this stuff, and they're targeting places like the local mosque, all this kind of stuff. But there are people sort of getting out there and opposing them, and they are in many cases actively getting somewhere and doing so, because it doesn't take a lot to um, showcase that these people are more disruptive than they are representative of local communities. Um, so the media is again unlikely to be reporting that end of things. They've got a narrative. That narrative is patriotic groups are doing this, that, and the other. The Labour Party are very supportive of it, etc. But it is happening and it is out there. Um, Honestly, we should probably, we've now gone well over the hour just on the one topic, although we've kind of moved around various bits and bobs. And should probably move on to the Tory conference, which has been fabulous from the perspective of politics watching on the left, as every headline that's come out of it has been just genuinely miserable. Not just the content, but the tone, from nobody being there, including no protesters, because who can be bothered to protest at Tory conference these days, to Kemi Badenoch having to make excuses for Robert Jenrick after he utterly humiliated her. It's the sort of thing where it was like, why are you even still doing this at this stage? It seems like just week after week of just miserable nothingness. Of course, the downside is obviously that Jenrick's just outright racism is likely to end up being the new leadership. Um, Not that he'll ever be in power, I doubt.
Yeah, and I think the thing with Jenrick is it's amazing to me that we're seeing the playbook again in terms of somebody who was very clearly not, pardon the expression, a man of the people, trying to pretend that he's a man of the people, and he's only thinking what other people are thinking. Well, actually, no, most people aren't actually overtly thinking what you're thinking. Definitely not. But nonetheless, he's trying to, obviously he's trying to play that populist, right populist thing. Obviously making comments that are clearly racist, in terms of what he said about walking through the area of Birmingham and so on. But nonetheless, this is somebody who's been a government minister. This is somebody who has, if I remember rightly, did he go to Oxford? He went to or one of these places. I don't know if he did actually go to Oxford, but somebody who is essentially establishment as they come. Somebody who has been a government minister. Somebody who's been in trouble a lot. Actually, as a government minister, if we think back far enough, all sorts of issues over planning permission and all this sort of stuff. Things that were involved in as a minister. If you go down the wiki, there's lots of scandals. Let's put it that way. And yet they're a man of the people. Do you know what I mean? They want to portray
Yeah,
themselves in that way, in the way that obviously Donald Trump did, the way that Nigel Farage does, and all that sort of stuff. And you sit there and think, And here we go again, and just to the wider point about Tory conference and Badenoch and the whole situation, I think I see it in two different ways. I think one is it's absolutely hilarious. Of course, it's hilarious. Those of us on the left who've lived long enough and suffered enough at the hands of the Tories, and the communities have suffered, that's great. It's fantastic. The bad bit of it is, and this is not an apology for the Tory party, um, is the reason it's not doing very well isn't because there's any left alternative. It's not doing very well because they're all going to reform. And the reality is actually significant chunks of big business and the media have thrown in a lot with reform and are serious about it, which they would never were with UKIP, for instance, which makes reform far more credible because the normal response at this point was, well, they'll all come flooding back to the Tories in an election cycle and they'll all donate to the Tories then. And, if you think back to the Hague period when he was leader, for instance, yeah, it's going to be really bad for the Tories for a few years, but they'll all come running back. And they did, ultimately. I think the problem here is they're not going to do that, actually. They think the
Mm.
Tories are a busted flush. And so they are going to go in another direction. And the other direction is going to be the far right. And you're in a situation now where, like, people used to worry about, the nature of the first past the post electoral system, and it wouldn't let third parties have a fair crack, the Lib Dems or the Greens or whoever it might be. I'm not these days a practicing psephologist, studier of elections as I used to be. I'm not working in politics anymore as I used to in foreign politics. But I think this is a chance where actually you will see a party come from absolutely nowhere to form a majority because of the level of backing that they have. And that's actually scary. And so on the one hand, I am laughing at the Tory conference. I'm laughing at the empty seats. I'm laughing at the fact that they're tying themselves up in knots over announcements. I'm not laughing at what Jenrick said, because what Jenrick said obviously is incredibly dangerous and just offensive and hurtful to a large constituency of well, our people, fundamentally. Um, so I'm not laughing at that by any means. Badenoch's plight, Badenoch is just awful, and I think the reality is now that the problem is they've lost ownership of the brand of basically far right politics, which is where the Tory party was headed for a long time after Brexit. It was heading there anyway. It embraced it. It'd done a lot of things that reform. I mean, the Rwanda plan, for instance, that was a racist policy. End of story. It was a racist policy straight out of Powellism. That's what it was. And that kind of sentiment was prevalent in the Tory party. It had gone there. And it's still not enough. There was a party further to the right than they are, and people are going there. So six of one, half dozen the others, to use a football phrase for me. It was really fun to watch how bad it was. On the other hand, yeah, because there's another demon waiting in the wings, and it's a pretty horrific one. So it's kind of where I was at with it.
Yeah. So just to look up Jenrick, he was you were nearly there. He was first class BA in history from Cambridge. Um,
Oh God.
Former director of Christie's auction house, and his dad was former managing director of Canon Industries. The thing which is going to sink him primarily is that he was Minister of State for Immigration from 2022 to 2023. And there is absolutely no way he will ever live that down with the new reform loyalists, no matter how racist he goes.
Well,
Because,
these people are
he's
too right wing for Boris
tied to
Johnson.
Sunak.
These people
Yeah.
are too right wing, but you're absolutely spot on. These people are too right wing for Boris Johnson. They're not going to accept Robert Jenrick.
Um, we have a note from Nationwide Building Society higher up recently met with someone from Reform for a breakfast to see how Reform intend to do business, and I wonder what that was meant to be about. Yeah, I mean that's incredibly indicative that, and it's essentially the same phenomenon as the empty seats, which is Tory conference when the Tories were still a going concern, even though it was always a bit of a joke that they had a half empty conference hall. All of the big planning that was going on, all the conspiracy of big finance that was going to be happening, all the under the table stuff, which no individuals can be accused of specifically, but we all knew it was going on. Um, all of that was happening just outside in kind of the lobby rooms on the fringes, and none of that was happening at this conference because, as you say, groups like Nationwide and no doubt Big Oil and all the rest of them have already clocked that the chances of the Tories rejuvenating themselves, be it under Badenoch or 90% likely Jenrick as her successor, is going to end with the Tory party in power. I mean, one of the things that was noted fairly recently is that even within the Tories' percentage, which is either sort of on par or slightly lower than the Lib Dems, I think the last time I checked, um, it's more dispersed than the Lib Dems have got. And obviously, under, as you say, under the first past the post system, um, you're talking about an absolute wipeout. The Lib Dems by far higher than the Tories um, under the current setup.
Yeah, that's going to be a killer for them, isn't it? Because and you already saw a bit of this actually play out in the last election. Because obviously Reform split the Tory vote. Now they'll take the rest of that vote, except for the very small number of remaining nice. I don't necessarily think nice, but people who think they are nice Tories who couldn't vote Reform, who will vote Lib Dem presumably at the next election. So you're going to, I would suspect you could even see an increased Lib Dem vote. You could even see more Lib Dem seats in Parliament. It's not impossible.
I think quite
Yeah,
likely.
absolutely. And a Reform majority at the same time. I think that's entirely possible because I think Labour are going to take a shoe-in of biblical proportions, to quote Ghostbusters. I think they're going to take an absolute shoe-in. Both of the two main parties are going to take a shoe-in. I think that the Tory party may yet want to get on the proportional representation bus. They might, a bit late in the day, but they might want to try and embrace
Well,
that.
it's a weird one that, like, I mean, from reading kind of the right wing press, that the Tory party broadly, despite the fact that so much of its farthest right membership has moved over to Reform, is still largely of the opinion that Badenoch is, doing sort of positionally is doing okay, is roughly in line with what Jenrick is doing, which I find astonishing because I can't think of an easier way. Like, if the Conservatives move towards the centre, they could pick up vast swathes of the current Labour vote, um, because there's a lot of people in Labour who are essentially Tories at this stage,
Yeah,
and
absolutely. I'd
are
agree with that.
absolutely furious with Labour,
Yeah, and they could
and
get
are
back a
looking
lot
around
of
for somewhere else to go.
they could get a lot of Lib Dem votes back that they lost last time. My constituency where I live flipped from being a Tory to a Lib Dem at the last term. I didn't vote for either of them, of course. But flipped to the election. So they could get some of those back. I'd have no doubt they could get some of those back. I think part of the problem they've got is because they've drunk from the well of far right poison for such an extended period of time. If there are kind of, if you like, let's say for argument's sake, Kenneth Clark Tories who are still floating around, who are now voting for Starmer, which is entirely probable, or they're voting for the Lib Dems. Um, Actually, I don't know what their mentality is, and obviously everyone's an individual, so these group mentalities are always a bit dangerous to ascribe. But I would imagine some of them actually might be a bit wary of voting for the Conservatives. Suddenly they vote fast now and start to move to the centre, or found someone. They need to find someone who had impeccable credentials for that. And the problem the Tory party's got in a way is actually even before Badenoch, before Jenrick, even before Sunak, going back to Johnson, they purged those people. Those people were purged from the parliamentary party pretty much. So, and they increasingly had a candidates list that was filled with people who were far right. So they've now got a situation where what's left in the parliamentary party, is there anyone in there who could stand up and be like, well, I actually was, what's going to tick the boxes of your, self-styled wet Tory in 2025? I was pro-Remain. I was, you know, I believe in a small state and low taxation, but I do believe that, we should let gay people get on with their lives and, not be. Does that person still exist in the Tory parliamentary party, to actually help it
Doesn't
now?
I mean,
Mm.
so I think it was the Times was saying that the One Nation Tory grouping has long since dissolved itself. There are a few who are left over, but essentially they're now reduced to having you know a group dinner once a month, um, rather than actually being a force in the Tory party. So it seems very unlikely that they will or could, as you say, bring themselves to shift back towards the centre. such as it is. Um, but yeah, there just doesn't seem to be a future for them in continuing in the direction that they're going in either. I mean, yeah, politics is a mug's game to predict, but they do seem to be in a completely untenable position with no membership or impetus to find a way out. Um,
Yeah, there's some bad factors there, and just the something that occurred to me when you talk the One Nation group. Then reminds me of the old joke about the Liberal Party under Jeremy Thorpe. They could hold their shadow cabinet meetings in the back of a taxi, that kind of thing. And it does feel a bit like that, really. But yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a mug's game. You never know; they might do better than we expect. But I just think the issue is that despite being an incredibly successful governing party for so long, they seem to have drunk the Kool-Aid of social media to some degree and the far right politics to the extent that actually they don't realise that's an insurgent politics. An establishment party can't deliver that. It needs a party of the far right to deliver that. Or to be credible within and the issue is I mean, they've done essentially they've already done with the effect that it's going to have what Starmer is doing now. They have already done to themselves what Starmer's Labour is doing to
yeah,
itself, which is platforming these issues, making them relevant, accentuating them, telling everybody the right to believe in it. And then the people are going, oh, okay, then fair enough. We'll vote for the fella who actually means what he says. And they've already done that. Starmer's now following their playbook. So he's going to retire the Labour Party the way they've retired the Conservative Party. And I genuinely, like, at the risk of hubris, I don't see a way back for them. I don't. Because as you say, if the money is moving, that's the X factor. If the money is moving, I'm not saying business gets things right all the time because God knows we don't believe in capitalism. But at the same time, they don't, they're not hedging their bets. I think people are actually taking serious decisions about like, this is where I need to be. This is who I need to be associated with at a business level. And that's the end of them, really. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think actually there would be a possibility for them if they were to move to the centre, at the risk of sounding like, a new Labour theorist from the late 1990s, Anthony Giddens. But I don't think there's any chance they can now. And, I think Starmer's following their playbook.
yeah, did it to themselves. Well, it's no, right. We should probably wrap this up fairly soon. I will go through the many freedom stories of this week. Um, I mean, we can pick out any which you have a particular thing to say something about. So we have one from today, in fact. Protesters blockade Sheffield Weapons Factory in National Day of Action against the F-35. This is Stop Arming Israel, targeting forged solutions over its role in supplying fighter jets being used in Gaza. And they halted traffic entering the River Don site, standing in front of the gate with banners, chants, and speeches denouncing the company's complicity in Israel's genocide of Palestinians. I suppose these would fall fairly fulsomely into the regular protest bracket, according to Labour. This is also on the same day. There has been a paint action against Palantir in London, with a surveillance company being targeted for its role in the Gaza genocide. Shut the system, saying its activists destroyed entrances, glass panels, security cameras, and ID card readers. So very comprehensive at Palantir Technologies' London office in Soho Square. Then doused the facade in red paint. So it seems that even the prescribing of Palestine Action has not entirely done away with direct action against property. Moving on from that, we have War and Extractivism, a view from Sudan and Congo. So this is more of a featurey piece. But two activists from Sulfa, a media outlet founded by Sudanese exiles in France, and Génération Lumière, a decolonial ecology association founded by young Congolese people in Lyon, discussing the ongoing wars in Congo and Sudan. And obviously, this is a topic that we don't cover nearly in depth enough, but we do make an effort once in a while.
Yeah, I think I'd encourage if folks haven't read that. I would encourage people to read that. I think it's fascinating. I think it's also terrifying. Because one of the things that comes out of that is how bad things are in Sudan, and the claim that the comrade is making in that piece is that it's not heard by the world. I think that's absolutely right. It's not heard by the world. And I was lamentably ignorant. I mean, I knew stuff was going down. I knew the vague parameters of it. I didn't know the detail. And actually, the explanation that comes through in it is very powerful and very succinct. One of the pieces that I think should really gall us is the extent to which, kind of culpability of European nation states in it, but also in Congo as well. And the other side of it, how culpable our societies are in that. And also on the Congo element of it, talking about something that I think a lot of us on the left know about, which is the issues around coltan and coltan mining and what that means. Um, but also the fact that, it's on a scale you couldn't imagine, and obviously it's drawing other countries into the conflict and so on. And it is ultimately to fuel the technology that we're watching this on. It's to fuel the technology that we have in our pockets. So I found that dialogue really powerful, actually, from people from different places talking about shared experiences of essentially things that are being fomented, if you like, at least in part by the dynamics of essentially consumer demand elsewhere in the world. So yeah, or actually two big issues that come through in the dialogue. One is consumer demand, particularly in coltan, and also how much the EU is doing and nation states in Europe are doing to finance potentially very dodgy people to prevent immigration to Europe that then leads to civil wars elsewhere, or people using the weapons that have been financed by the EU to go and kill other people elsewhere. So, yeah, really chastening piece, but really powerful piece, really good to read, and encourage people to read.
It's one of those ones where, whenever kind of the far right bangs on about migration, you're sort of saying, well, the problem is that it's very complex talking through the process of, well, Europe involves itself in these nations in such a way as to encourage migration, and then has to spend vast sums of money trying to stop um, said migration in a kind of incredibly self-centered feedback loop, which does itself, uh, very little good in the end, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
and
like
this
it
is a
makes a
trite
lot of
point.
profit for companies.
Well, it's a trite point from me, this, but yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I think, but it comes down to other and done it. And ultimately, the only way these arguments have purchased is because basically people have been convinced to view people of a different colour than themselves or a different ethnicity themselves as less than human. And that's at a
100%.
fundamental level. That's where CRT is absolutely right. That's where these critiques are right. They've been encouraged to do it for hundreds of years, at least since the Enlightenment. And the net result of that is that there's no ownership or responsibility taken for what your country does in somebody else's country, because ultimately they're not people the same as you. And the net result of that is, like, as you say, if you do start from a place which all anarchists must start from, which is the people are people and nobody is privileged over anybody else, then if you start from that place, then it's very easy to see exactly what you've just said, which is actually people don't want to leave their homes. People don't want to leave their families. People don't want to go on long journeys where their families' lives are jeopardized or their own lives are jeopardized to be treated like scum in some other country where people think they're better than them when they're not. They don't want to do any of that. They do that because the people whose country they've gone to have unleashed marauding armies and militaries and weapons on their country because they want a mobile phone that has an AI integration. I mean, that's what it boils down to. So, yeah, chasing and peace, really powerful piece, but most importantly of all, spoken by folks themselves, able to give an account of themselves rather than being spoken for. So, I'd encourage people to read that.
Yep, absolutely agree. Moving on to the last few articles, I will rattle them through. There is Yava Torinsky, who does really interesting media of all kinds, has written an obituary for Val Todorov, a political activist and award-winning science fiction author who was a visionary of alternatives to capitalism, and Yavor is writing about the immense legacy he left for social and cultural movements in Bulgaria. So that's well worth a read if you're interested in, particularly in Bulgarian anarchist politics, I suppose. Continuing a couple of pieces. Kevin Thrakra has been writing about the prison system. So we were sort of talking, or I was talking with Andy last week about we probably at some point should have a proper show about prisons in Britain, because we kind of reference them a fair bit, but don't go into a lot of detail. But for people who want to catch up on the complete mess that is the prison system in Britain, and obviously it's only going to get worse if they keep jailing activists and peaceful protesters, then there's at least two articles on so far, and I have no doubt more will be written in the near future on the website. The most recent piece is Finland struggles against the right-wing government. 2 years of anti-government protests are raising questions about organising around collective struggles. And this is because Finland has an extremely right-wing administration at the moment, and protests against it have been, as usual. Left marches don't make quite the impact that people hope, but direct action might.
Come
And
back to the
finally,
sorry, just come back to the prison piece before we move on. Yeah, I mean, I think we should do something on prisons in general because, again, to make a fairly banal point, really, for anarchists, but the issue is what happens in prisons is what happens to the rest of us ultimately. We should always have solidarity with incarcerated workers and incarcerated comrades because ultimately, what is test driven, if you like, in terms of the inhumanity and degradation that's subjected to people who are incarcerated, is what portends for the rest of us. So it's not an original thought of mine by any means. It's one that's obviously prevalent in anarchism and not just anarchism. So yeah, no, I think it'd be very valuable for us to do that, and it's welcome that we've got someone who is writing for us at the moment who is able to speak with that vantage point as well.
definitely. And just to round off, there is an interview with Ruvikonas from Blade Runner, which is an anarchist collective in Greece, and he's done. There will be a longer version of that interview, hopefully coming up in the next journal, which we are due to be bringing out, hopefully towards the end of this month. But we will keep you updated on that. And I think that is all of the stories that were fit to print in this week's Freedom. So on that note, thank you very much, Mike, for, as ever, an excellent conversation going on for a whole hour and a half. It was a bit longer than usual, but lots to talk about. Thank you, everybody.